our next speaker, Dr. Carmen Bugan. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. Um, and Dr. Carmen Bugan is the George Orwell Prize Fellow. She's also the author of 5 poetry collections, among which Ladies from America, New and Selected Poems, a PBS special commendation. Her memoir, Burying the Typewriter, Childhood Under the Eye of the Secret Police, was a BBC Radio 4 Book of the Week, and her monograph on Seamus Heaney, I hope I'm saying it correctly, and East European poetry in translation, Poetics of Exile, has received wide recognition. Her book, Poetry and the Language of Oppression, Essays on Politics and Poetics, published at Oxford University Press in 2021, was named an essential book for writers by Poets and Writers. Her new book of poems, Time Being, praised by the Irish Times poetry editor for its disciplined precision, is just out. Dr. Carmen Bugan was a Creative Art Fellow in Literature at Wolfson College at Oxford University and a Hawthornden Fellow. She has a doctorate in English Literature from Balliol College at Oxford and currently teaches at the Gotham Writers Workshop in Manhattan. The title of today's talk is Resettling in the English Language. This lecture probes the poet's relationship with an adopted language, acknowledging losses and gains, and offers a glimpse into the experience of writing in between languages, hovering at the borders between them. As one resettles in a new language, the native and the adopted languages play more complex and subtle parts in the perception of self and of freedom, as the poet no longer defines one language in terms of another, one experience in terms of another, but seeks a language that brings feelings and experiences from both in continuously evolving lyric. Writing in an adoptive language ultimately heals and restores one to the language of birth. Dr. Carmen Bugan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mohammed and Theodore. I was very interested in what you had to say there, Theodore, in your talk. So I hope we could talk more about this. But coherence it is. The idea that literature is able, with the story, here we go to the power of language as giving us a sense of coherence. For I've written my books for my children, since I cannot give them the country anymore. I give them the story of the country, which I hope gives them that sense of identity that you were talking about in the positive sense of not being defined by an absence, but rather being defined by things that you could take from all the cultures and live an enriched life because you have so many available. And I also wanted very briefly to say that it might be interesting for us, maybe not now, but to consider another panel on aging and identity and diasporic identity, because if you look at the medical aspect of our lives, people suffering of Alzheimer's disease later in life, and they tend to come closer to their childhood as they are to their current time. I'm looking at my parents in their 80s. My father is 87 now. There is a distinct sense of return to Romania, even though we've been here 32 years. And I see the older communities at their church there in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Everybody becomes more Romanian the older they get. And so that would be interesting because I think it's the way our brains work. And it's not simple nostalgia. Is really returning to someone that you knew before, to your younger self. So anyway, I thought I'd throw that out before I started my paper here. My talk is Resettling in the English Language, and it does nothing less than complicating everything that you said there, Theodore, because poetic language does just that. It complicates things. I will start with one of the poems. It was published in my collection, The House of Straw, in 2014, called The Names of Things. sunlight in a water bowl on the doorstep, then on a pond far from home, Soirele. Fire in the terracotta hearth, then in a pit outside a tent, thousands of miles away, Focul. My black sea lolling the shore, then dreams of sea, waking cheeks with stinging salt, Mare. Air encircling the grapes outside the window, then gliding with a parachute above a heron, Aerul. Soil exhaling after rain through gaps between cherry leaves, then crying dirty tears from roots of a fallen birch, Pământul. I'd like to explain my relationship with the English language to offer a glimpse into writing in between languages, histories, and cultures. Though I do not articulate a classification of my national identity in the poetry itself, certain preoccupying questions tend to surface as a matter of belonging to a particular time and place. For instance, do I write as a Romanian, as an American, a Romanian American? And how important is it to place my writing in a context that focuses on national identity? In other words, how does one read the poem, The Names of Things, which I just read? The words defined carry the meaning of experiences lived in two places, expressed in a language not accessible to Romanian speakers. But English is not the same either. It contains foreign words, memories, and experiences. While most poets see the loss of their native tongues as akin to death, or at best as a condemnation to oblivion, my immigration to the English language presented the possibility to liberate myself from the language of oppression. I say liberation with specific reference to the sense of being able to speak without feeling overheard by hostile listeners. I was leaving behind the language in which I had been humiliated, betrayed, observed, recorded, transcribed, and analyzed by neighbors, relatives, and agents of the state. Years earlier, my father concluded, I don't want to breathe the air for nothing, and stood against injustice. The rather understated vow to silence my mother had to write and sign before our passports were granted was followed with death threats at the passport office if we talked about what had happened to us. Here is my mother's declaration in my translation. The undersigned Mioara Bugan, born Toncu on 5 July 1947 in the village of Drăgănești, district of Galați, the daughter of Dumitru and Otansa, currently living in Drăgănești, district of Galați, having received from the state of Romania the approval to leave the country permanently in order to settle in the United States of America, I assume responsibility never to damage in any way and in any circumstance the interests of the Romanian state and of the Romanian people. I assume the responsibility to remain forever loyal to the Romanian state and to defend this prestige abroad through my activities and through my behavior. Signed, Mioara Bugan, 25/04/1989. How is a political refugee to defend the interests of a dictatorship abroad, except by complete silence? First, my mother was abused for having remained loyal to her husband. When she was cast out, she was ordered to assume responsibility of loyalty to a state that had literally torn her life apart, precisely because she and my father defended the interests of the Romanian people. By the time she had signed this declaration, my father was accustomed to signing exit briefing forms from prisons, where he vowed not to speak about what he had endured or about what he had seen other political prisoners endure on the pain of returning to the chains. Of course, in the same language, I have seen the first light of day, keened for my dead grandmother, and wrote my first poems. When my family and I arrived in the US, I was 19 years old and all too ready to put the past in its place, to make a clean cut, in the full knowledge that language is not one thing only, but many things at the same time. If I was going to live a full life, it was imperative. If I was going to live a full life, it was imperative to break free of this language, for I never had an interest in remaining simply a victim. Though I continued to speak Romanian at home, for my writing, I chose to adopt the language of the country in which I had received political asylum, because it had adopted me in its largeness and its largesse. 30 years ago, my family and I were welcomed as immigrants to this country rather than being seen as foreign, polluting influences. The brand new language, where there was no history of political and personal oppression, represented a decisive chance at a kind of future, despite the difficulties ahead. And yes, I, for one, wanted to claim the right to tell my story, not to expose the state, not to go on trial, but to write myself free and write against silence. Looking back on the past 3 decades, I see that as a writer, I have been searching for the language of freedom, that language within language that depends on particulars of experience with words and resists the constraints of unreflective conventional usage. It's the language inside the Romanian in which I wrote the family poems when we lived under surveillance. The same one I had to find in English by trial and error. The language of my birth is a fundamental part of my poetry in English. Indeed, as a consequence of the births of my children and living in several countries, I have found myself becoming able to return to the language of early childhood, which has remained alive in my memory. This joyful source serves to recall the Romanian experience in the poetry in English in its fullness, acknowledging both the abundance of love and the cruelty of injustice. The condition of the poet who writes in a non-native language oscillates between self-translation and complete assimilation, and is based on a continuous reevaluation and renegotiation of the relationship with the abandoned and the adoptive languages, if one can ever say the word abandoned. One needs an actual place in language to plant roots, but that place keeps shifting by necessity. Initially, it is a language of exile where poetry is born at different points of contact between the two languages, as they recall memories of life lived in the first language. But first, the physical experience of exile. In Paradiso, Dante expresses his loss by recreating the sensory perception of another's bread and the difficulty of going up and down someone else's stairs. The excerpt, which will be familiar to most of Dante's readers, comes from Canto 17 of Paradiso, lines 54 to 60. tu lascerai ogni cosa diletta più caramente. E questo è quello strale che l'arco dello esilio pria saetta. Tu proverai, siccome sa di sale lo pane altrui, e come duro cale lo scendere e salire per l'altrui scale. My own translation, based on Charles Singleton's literal rendering, and the commentary reads, you will leave everything you hold dearest. This is what the bow of exile will shoot first. You will taste the salt of another's bread and learn the hardship of your path as you descend and mount another's stairs. Dante no longer tastes the bread. He tastes only the salt in it. Exile having partially crippled his sense of something as ordinary and wholesome. Going up and down the stairs is no longer a way of ascending parts of the house. It only makes him feel the hardship. One is defined by the experience of losing the familiar. Acknowledging the loss. Losing the native language, not hearing it spoken, not having it available to explain oneself in it, not knowing the currency of words and how to calibrate one's own use of them, shatters the carefully constructed protective layers of personal identity. At best, for those fleeing oppression, this can be enabling, working as a pathway to internal freedom and self-definition. But at worst, it can be debilitating. The immigrant, the exile, experiences both extremes before settling at the crossroads as a creature with a mind in two places at once. I return here to Mowbray's exile speech in Richard II, which I read when I learned enough English to cross over from Romanian translations to the original. This to me was more than a speech. It expressed how I felt as an outcast immigrant to America. The sense of banishment in a speech in the Shakespearean world, that implacable never to return, helped me form from a literary perspective, rather than from real life experience, an understanding of the language of oppression wielded from a place of power. I also discovered a way to explain the feeling of being cast off in poetry. This in turn showed me that poetry and politics have far more in common than Brodsky had admitted to himself when he said that they only shared the letters P and O. Poetry can articulate the damage done by political decisions. And here's the speech. Richard II, the hopeless word of never to return, breathe I against thee upon pain of life. Thomas Mowbray. A heavy sentence, my most sovereign liege, and all unlooked from your highness's mouth. A dearer merit, not so deep a main as to be cast forth in a common air, have I deserved at your highness's hands. The language I have learned these 40 years, my native English, now I must forgo. And now my tongue's use is to me no more than an unstringed viol or a harp, or like a cunning instrument cased up or being open, put into his hands that knows no touch to turn the harmony. Within my mouth, you have enjailed my tongue, doubly portcullised with my teeth and lips, and dull, unfeeling, barren ignorance is made my jailer to attend on me. I am too old to fawn upon a nurse, too far in years to be a pupil now. What is thy sentence then but speechless death, which robs my tongue from breathing native breath? The use of the word or reveals the mental pressure Mowbray feels as he reaches for image after image to describe what he imagines it must feel to cross the border of his country without the language to help make himself understood. Each or opened a space for me in Mowbray's speech, where my memories could unfurl, the packing of the suitcase, the study of English from school notebooks, and the dictionary my father gave us to prepare for the journey ahead. The very English which I dreamed of learning as a child, who could never dream of living in another language. To be sure, we had escaped a quite possible death. Exile was what had immediately and decisively saved us. Yet, the experience of those first years with no command of English was deeply alienating. Later on, when we explained in our newly learned language what had happened to us, we seemed to our hosts less than believable because our experience in Romania had no equivalent in America. Jailed and tortured for a protest, house arrest. I asked myself if our story was of use to anyone else. Explaining what it was like to be persecuted in one language and free in another, and whether everything was as clear or as simple as that, easily reduced to the dichotomy Romanian oppression, English freedom, left me defensive and frustrated. My understanding of freedom has changed with the fluency in the English language. So many are not free in a land we, prospective political refugees from behind the Iron Curtain, had imagined full of milk and honey. I confess that unease sets in these days when the present begins to look a little bit like the past. And yet, writing poetry in English. I began writing in English at the confluence of languages, nourished by unfamiliar sounds of words, at first translating my poems from memory. Here is an excerpt from an essay published in Modern Poetry in Translation in 2004, where I was asked to explain why, as a poet, I relinquished my native language. My experience of writing poetry in English can best be explained by telling you about the making of the poem about my parents' divorce. In Romanian, years ago, I called it divorțul, or the divorce. When I began dreaming in English, and when the words started to come to me in English, I felt an undercurrent of newness inside. There was freedom and exhilaration. My tongue was slowly getting untied, and I wanted to see what it all sounded like in my new language. First, I wrote what I remembered of the poem in Romanian, and then I tried to translate it. It was called successfully The Courtroom, An Oath of Love, and finally, again, The Divorce. Many of the first English versions had too many explanations in them. Why my mother was forced to divorce, what happened in a courtroom, as though the whole history of the country needed to be told just so that the poetry itself could come through. Then, as I got more settled in my faraway place, I learned how the narrative could be put into images, which conjure back the narratives. And so it happened with many other poems until the English language began to thrill me with its sounds, and the Romanian words never returned to translate the poems back. Lately, I think that it would take much effort to put the culture I'm writing from now into the Romanian culture I have left before the revolution. And if I tried to write in Romanian now, it would be more like going back home on an old linguistic map. Now, that was 2004. I will quote from the original poem in Romanian here, the first translation of it in English that was published in Bearing the Typewriter, and then give the final version of the poem in English. The major shift in the poem is in the point of view. The I of the poem in the original is the grief-stricken girl speaking directly to her father from the heart of pain. The woman in a final English version is removed in terms of time, experience, and language, and speaks as an omniscient narrator who is able to see the courtroom scene with detachment. I believe that the English language facilitated this necessary change of perspective, which is part of the creative process. Unde ești, tăticule? Lacrimile-mi curg și roaie. De ce ai plecat, tată? Ai lăsat în urmă furtuni și ploaie. Sărută-ne, tată, sărută-ne pe noi, că nu se știe niciodată când vom ieși din noroi. Father, where are you? My tears flow and flow. Why did you leave us, Father? You left us inside thunderstorms. Kiss us, Father. Bless us with your kisses, for we'll never know when we'll come out of this mud. By the time I was 15 years old and I had written this poem, I was immersed in a soulful, plangent, and philosophical poetry of Mihai Eminescu, 1850-1889, who was considered our last romantic and the first to put the roots of modernism in our national poetry. His language was musical, his thoughts profoundly appealing to my sense of desolation. And though he was taught at school as someone who represented nationhood, he created a different world in language from the verse propaganda practiced at the time. I was drawn to his poems of love and nature. He was an escape, and I had internalized the rhythms and the tone of his poetry. And here are some samples from Dintre sute de catarge of the 100 sailboats. The poem is about the fragility of what's within and the cruelty of what's outside. Neînțeles rămâne gândul ce-ți străbate cânturile, zboară veșnic îngânându-l valurile, vânturile. In my unrhymed translation, this reads, obscure will remain the thought that crosses your songs. It flies eternally mocked by wind, by waves. And second poem I want to quote from there is from To the Star, La Steaua. Icoana stelei ce-a murit încet pe cer se suie. Era pe când nu s-a zărit, azi o vedem și nu e. In my translation again, this reads, the icon of the star that died rises slowly in the sky. It lived when no one saw it. We see it when it's not there. The sounds of this poetry were in the first pieces I wrote in my youth in a way which was instinctual. My poem, written directly to my father in the simplest and most direct language I knew, had roots in the poetry that was nourishing me. For all the silence imposed on me in my native language, I uttered those cries in the cocoon of home. During the 1990s, I was building a home in a different language, and I would say that this sound was the immediate loss. My first English was the one written on food and medicine labels, traveling directions, and textbooks. It took me some years to step on the ground of the literary language, that suggestive, deep, rich, and disorientating landscape where I couldn't sense what was underneath. In my Romanian language, the ground had a cemetery, a buried typewriter, and buried bottles of sunflower oil, all of which eventually have made their way into my poems in English. It was the work of the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz, who had resettled in America decades earlier, writing, I learned at last to say, this is my home, in a rare poem in English called Turaja Rao, that was to remain a source of sustenance. His biography is inextricably linked to his writing, and I found comfort in his unease. Miloš, who in the same poem characterizes himself ill at ease in the tyranny, ill at ease in the republic, yearning for freedom in one and the end of corruption in the other, found stability in language itself. To find my home in one sentence, concise as if hammered in metal. This is not to enchant or to earn fame, he says in the same poem, but to resist chaos and nothingness. That is, to do something beyond expressing his private sorrows. His devotion to his native language, my faithful mother tongue, has never wavered. In the poem with the same name, he professes to offer his Polish language little balls of color, bright and pure if possible, because he says, perhaps, after all, it is I who must try to save you. How this poem unsettled the self I have become building in my adopted language, and how his poem preface, where he advises, first, plain speech in the mother tongue, hearing you should be able to see, searched me. I felt that I had failed a sacred duty to my native language, and I needed to embark on the way of bringing my Romania in the English language, which has been the work of the past 20 years. One must recognize that history happens one person at a time, and that each one of us has an individual and personal relationship with language. I had to make my own way. In what I'm calling self-translation, I needed to carry myself as a human being first into the new language before I could intuit what was possible to bring in and what was not, and what sounded off the key. Then, as I achieved fluency, I could take liberties with the first poem, The Divorce, to the point that the poem finally echoed through in English. And I will end with reading the final version of The Divorce in English. Before they brought him to the courtroom, they gave him 3 apples. Your wife sent you these. He cradled each apple in a cup of his hands. The smoothness of their skin became the cheeks of each child. Inside the courthouse, there was a quiet opening and closing of doors. A crowd of people was chanting his name under the windows. When the door opened, I saw his bare feet in brown shoes. His children held each other tight against the wall. Their breaths, white with cold, were rising towards the ceiling. They listened for the voices of their parents. When the divorce was over, he was allowed to see them. They kissed his chained hands, promised to be good, let their tears fall on his prison uniform with his own, all 3 of them bearing him. How I wished we could hide him with our bodies and take him home. The Securitate peeled us off him, but we were the apple seeds left to grow in the sound of his chains on the cement floor. In writing directly in another language, there's nothing to translate. The divorce poem in the English language and to the English language, I brought the language of poetry up against the language of oppression with an image that ultimately imagines, and in imagining, reaches for self-liberation. The apples, the fruit of childhood from our own garden, but also the ones the interrogators have given to my father, pretending Mom sent them to him. feel that the divorce, to make him feel that through the divorce he will lose his 3 children, they bear the taste of freedom, even if that figures as seeds on a cement floor. Whether this poem and many others make it possible to identify myself as a Romanian or an American poet, I'm not sure myself. I suspect that writing in a non-native language places one in a world family where national classification seems less urgent than the concern with the themes in poetry that cross boundaries of countries and languages.